At 4 a.m. on April 29th, 1975, the Fall of Saigon turned into a race against time. Tan Son Nhut, the last airport that could still move people out of Saigon in large numbers, remained operational. Through the night, transport planes had been evacuating as many as they could. The North Vietnamese artillery began hitting the airport. Shells struck the South Vietnamese General Staff compound and naval headquarters. 2 American Marines were killed, aircraft were damaged, and fuel storage erupted into a fiery blaze. The runway was being torn up by shell fire and blocked with dropped ordnance and fuel tanks. At 7:30 a.m., South Vietnam's new president requested the American military mission leave within 24 hours. The American ambassador, Graham Martin, agreed and ordered the Defense Attaché office evacuated. Now all that mattered was confirmation. Could the transport planes keep the evacuation moving? The answer came at 10:40 a.m. Washington was told that the runway could no longer be used for a large-scale airlift. Minutes later, Henry Kissinger ordered Operation Frequent Wind to begin within the hour. And with that, America's last chance to move large numbers out quickly was over. Those still stranded in Saigon would now have to wait for helicopters, a few at a time, lifting out far smaller numbers while the North Vietnamese army closed in around them. That is how the end of America's war collapsed into the images the world still remembers. What happened next would be chaotic and iconic. But to understand how the city reached that desperate final scene, you have to go back to the decisions that made this final escape inevitable. The story did not begin with helicopters over Saigon. It began 4 months earlier. In the first week of January 1975, North Vietnamese forces attacked Phuoc Long with tanks and divisional strength. Saigon watched it happen. President of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, and his senior military command chose not to send a major relief force. Part of that was military reality. A rescue column could be trapped and destroyed. But the larger result was political. Washington did not intervene. When Phuoc Long fell, the North Vietnamese leadership knew the United States wanted out of the war. South Vietnam could now be hit harder and harder without risking sustained American retaliation. If you want more stories from history's collapsing fronts, then consider subscribing for more, because this is the moment Saigon's final crisis was set in motion. For the North Vietnamese, the next decision was where to strike for the blow that could break South Vietnam fastest. Some wanted the next campaign centered on the Mekong Delta. Others pushed for Me Thuot in the Central Highlands. That argument mattered because Me Thuot was not just another city on the map. It sat at a point that could split South Vietnam's military position and force Saigon into retreat. Between January 20th and 24th, Hanoi made its decision. Me Thuot would be the main target. Phuoc Long had shown them what America would not do. Now they were ready to find out what South Vietnam could no longer stop. In Saigon, President Thieu's answer to the crisis was to give up ground and try to save strength further south. But then, Me Thuot was hit. On March 9th, North Vietnamese forces struck Duc Lap, southwest of the city, and cut the roads around Pleiku. The next day, they attacked Me Thuot, directly in the Central Highlands. That mattered because Me Thuot helped hold the whole highland position together. If it fell, Pleiku and Kon Tum further north were exposed, and South Vietnam risked losing control of the entire region in one movement. But that is what happened. Me Thuot fell, and 2 days later, Saigon made the danger even worse. The military high command pulled the airborne division out of one corps in the north and sent it south to help retake the city, weakening one front that still held to try to restore another that had already fallen. Then the orders widened. On March 13th, President Thieu instructed his military command to abandon Quang Tri and Tu U Tien, the 2 northern provinces above Da Nang, and begin pulling back one corps. South Vietnam was no longer trying to hold everything it still had. It was deciding what might still be saved. The next morning, General Phu, the commander in the Central Highlands, told President Thieu what the fall of Me Thuot now meant. The city was gone, Pleiku was under siege, the roads were cut, helicopters were too few, and there were no reserve forces that could restore the situation. But then President Thieu came away with two ideas at once. Me Thuot should be retaken, while Pleiku and Kontum should simultaneously be abandoned. And that confusion was disastrous. Saigon was now sliding into two separate retreats at the same time. In the Central Highlands, General Phu was trying to pull forces out of Pleiku and Kontum toward the coast. And in the north, General Chuang was trying to decide whether Hue and Da Nang could still be held. The first retreat was the one through the highlands. A retreat on that scale needed one plan, one route, and tight control. But instead, General Phu had to plot an escape after Route 19. The main road from Pleiku to the coast had already been cut and was under heavy North Vietnamese fire. So he chose Route 7B instead, a secondary road that looked like the only remaining exit. The withdrawal began on March 15th, but the route was in bad condition. The bridges were a problem, and the movement began under confused orders. Then, at the Ba River crossing, it turned into catastrophe. Vehicles piled up at the ford. Engineers tried to force a way across. South Vietnamese airstrikes hit their own troops, and tanks sank in the riverbed. Men drowned trying to cross, and while the column was trapped and exposed, North Vietnamese fire tore into it. At the same time as the disastrous Central Highlands retreat, the separate northern retreat was starting to form. General Chuang argued that Hue and Da Nang could still be defended, but Hue was already under severe pressure. General Chuang's subordinate, Lieutenant General T, drew up a withdrawal plan around Tu Hen Inlet and Tan Mai Port, but it depended on ships, engineers, and a crossing that had to be created under fire, and almost none of that worked. One commercial ship carried about 5,000 family members of the 1st Division, while tens of thousands were left behind. At Tu Hen, attempts to create a crossing collapsed under water current, delay, and North Vietnamese fire. On paper, there was still a route out, but in practice, there was no escape. So Saigon's response was to attempt to widen the withdrawals again. On the evening of March 24th, after being told Hue could not be held, General Chuang ordered the evacuation of Hue and withdrawals further south toward Chu Lai. But then, the next day, Saigon ordered the Marine Division released immediately for the defense of the capital. General Chuang protested that Da Nang could not be held without it, and he was right. Da Nang was filling with refugees. Food, water, police control, and troop discipline were breaking down. What had started at Me Thuot as a battlefield defeat had turned into the unraveling of South Vietnam itself. And once that happened, the question was no longer how to hold South Vietnam together, but how to escape it. The chaos of the South Vietnamese withdrawals in March 1975 was a warning for American planners. The failed escapes had brutally exposed what happened when too many people tried to get out too late. Crowds crushed the exits. Control broke down. Soldiers, civilians, and vehicles all jammed together. So Washington began building the machinery for a final evacuation before that same kind of ending arrived at America's doorstep in Saigon. But building it was not the same as controlling it. On March 26th, the 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade was alerted. General Richard Carey started moving through Okinawa and Subic. By April 10th, American ships were stationed off the coast of South Vietnam, and officers from the Defense Attaché Office began briefing the Marines on what might soon have to be done. But the scale of the preparations kept growing because the immediate danger kept growing. Inside Saigon, embassy staff were quietly building their own evacuation system. Buses, safe houses, and routes from pickup points across the city to Tan Son Nhut, because the airport was the main place of escape for evacuees. But they also kept the communications network to Americans only, because if word spread too early, panic could wreck the evacuation before it even began. By April 5th, American planners had completed a helicopter evacuation option for Saigon, backed by security forces and amphibious support. 3 days later, Washington ordered planning on several different scales, varying from a few thousand people up to as many as 200,000. The significance of that planning was clear. America was no longer preparing for an orderly withdrawal. It was instead preparing for the possible collapse of Saigon. But one thing still could not be planned away. Ships could be moved, helicopters could be readied, pickup routes could be drawn. Yet none of that answered the question that mattered most. How much time was actually left before the war reached Saigon? By early April, the warnings inside Saigon were increasing. Frank Snepp, a CIA analyst in the city, was warning that Hanoi had accelerated its timetable toward the capital and was not interested in a negotiated settlement. But Ambassador Graham Martin and CIA Station Chief Thomas Polgar were slower to accept that conclusion. They still believed political change in Saigon could delay the end. The intelligence was moving one way, and senior American leadership was still leaning another. But the battlefield was moving in the same direction as the warnings. On April 9th, North Vietnamese forces opened the Battle of Xuan Loc, 37 miles northeast of Saigon, with artillery, tanks, and a 3-division attack. Xuan Loc controlled a key road junction on their approach to the capital. If it fell, the road to Saigon was wide open. The South Vietnamese 18th Division initially fought hard enough to repel the first attacks, and the government rushed in more support because it had to. But that was the problem. Even when South Vietnam still managed to hold a line, it was now doing it only to buy time, not to recover the war. And the warning signs did not stop there. Between April 10th and 13th, General Richard Carey, the Marine commander, alongside other Marine planners, surveyed evacuation sites around Saigon. They expected Newport and Tan Son Nhut to carry the main burden of extraction, not the embassy. They laid out helicopter landing zones around the Defense Attaché office compound. But Carey came away with the same impression others were starting to reach. Concern inside Saigon was still not matching the speed of the danger. Then the fighting shifted further up the coast. On April 12th, North Vietnamese commanders chose to attack Phan Rang on the coastal route north of Saigon instead of bypassing it, because Tan Son Air Base had to be knocked out. But even when South Vietnamese intelligence picked up the next planned attack, it still could not turn the warning into control. Before dawn on April 16th, an EC-47 electronic surveillance aircraft intercepted clear radio traffic, pointing to an incoming major North Vietnamese armored assault. South Vietnamese officers launched airstrikes, but the road defense itself was still too weak. The position collapsed anyway. But even before that assault landed, the intelligence picture had already sharpened. On April 15th, one of Snepp's best sources reported that Hanoi had chosen final victory. From that point on, the issue was not what Hanoi intended, it was whether Saigon could react in time. That was the split inside Saigon. The evidence was hardening, the evacuation system was being built, but the leadership still had not caught up with the speed of the collapse. After April 19th, the Evacuation Control Center began working through nightly pickup lists. East of Saigon, Xuan Loc was still holding, but while it held, the rest of the endgame was already closing in. Then, disaster struck. The line at Xuan Loc finally gave way. On April 21st, after days of heavy fighting, the South Vietnamese 18th Division pulled back from Xuan Loc toward the Tran Van Huong line. That ended the last major attempt to hold the eastern approach to Saigon. Xuan Loc had bought time, but nothing more. Therefore, the political center in Saigon had to move faster. So on that same day, President Thieu resigned and handed power to Vice President Nguyen Van Thieu. But the transfer changed nothing on the ground. The road east of the capital was opening, and Saigon was now trying to rearrange political authority faster than the battlefield was collapsing. American planners now moved closer to the evacuation they had been trying to conceal. On April 22nd, orders went out for a major plane-based evacuation of Americans. Marine planners prepared assembly points and wanted visible rooftop aids to guide helicopters in. But Ambassador Martin still resisted anything that looked openly like preparation for the end. At the same time, Hanoi accelerated their plans for the final victory. On April 22nd, North Vietnamese party leader Le Duong ordered that every day now counted. At Loc Ninh, the plan for the final assault on Saigon was approved. Therefore, the race was no longer between diplomacy and collapse. It was between American preparation and North Vietnamese speed. But even then, the American plan still rested on a dangerous assumption. Between April 22nd and 28th, the advanced Marine team found that some preparations were being made in Saigon. Helicopter zones were cleared, barbed wire was added, assembly points were prepared. But the overall evacuation plan was still incomplete, and it still assumed Tan Son Nhut would carry the main burden, not the embassy itself. Therefore, the planning widened yet again. On April 24th, American commanders completed an even larger evacuation option, one that included aircraft, helicopters, and boats, and even considered seizing the Vung Tau Peninsula southeast of Saigon as a coastal evacuation zone if the state disintegrated. But Saigon was still searching for one last political answer. Nguyen Van Huong had replaced Thieu as president, yet he was not seen as the man who could deliver the new political settlement some still mistakenly hoped for. So ongoing pressure for change continued, and on April 28th, Huong handed the presidency to Duong Van Minh, the third president in 8 days. However, Minh did not enter office under negotiation. He entered office under attack, with anti-aircraft fire crackling over Saigon. The capital still had an airport. It still had a government. But one more blow was about to push both toward collapse and force the evacuation into open crisis. Before dawn on April 29th, the scene we opened on was already unfolding at Tan Son Nhut. North Vietnamese artillery was hammering the airbase. The runway was becoming unusable. The last transport plane evacuation out of Saigon was collapsing. And by late morning, Henry Kissinger had ordered Operation Frequent Wind to begin within the hour. But helicopters solved one problem only by creating several more. At 11:13 a.m., the coded signal went out over the radio. "I'm dreaming of a white Christmas." That was the trigger. Around Saigon, the pickup system shifted from secrecy to overt action. By 11:30, even CIA station chief Thomas Polgar had given up on a political settlement. But while the signal could start the evacuation, it did nothing to solve the chaos that came with it. Out at sea, Admiral Donald Whitmire now had to turn ships, helicopters, Marines, and fighter cover into one working system. Lift aircraft were spread across the fleet. Marines had to be moved to helicopters, or helicopters moved to Marines. Departures had to be synchronized. The weather was poor, so pilots had to use tight air corridors into and out of Saigon. Therefore, even before the first helicopters reached the city, the evacuation was already being squeezed by restricted timing, air, and deck space. But now the city itself was becoming the next bottleneck. By around noon, the first major helicopter waves were lifting from the fleet. Bus convoys reached Tan Son Nhut, and Marines began securing landing zones at the airport. There, the evacuation was harsh but orderly. People were grouped, moved, and loaded in sequence. But Tan Son Nhut was not the only exit the Americans now had to hold. The embassy was a separate evacuation point inside Saigon itself, more exposed, more crowded, and already starting to choke under the pressure. South Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Van Thieu was publicly demanding that the Americans leave, while President Duong Van Minh was still trying to decide whether the South Vietnamese Navy should stay as leverage or leave the capital. That was why the bottlenecks were multiplying. The Americans were no longer trying to hold one shrinking exit, but two, while the South Vietnamese state itself was starting to pull apart around them. At the airport, the Marines secured 3 landing areas and started sorting thousands of refugees into lift groups. But the embassy compound inside Saigon was too lightly protected. Therefore, General Richard Carey, the Marine commander, shifted 130 Marines from Tan Son Nhut to reinforce the Chancery, the embassy's main building. That made the embassy safer, but it also split security forces between two evacuation sites at the very moment the city was overrunning the evacuation plan. But then the embassy crisis grew again. Kerry discovered that the problem was not a few hundred people waiting for extraction, but 1,000 or 2,000. The plan had assumed Tan Son Nhut would bear the main load. Instead, the embassy itself was turning into a second major evacuation zone inside a city already running out of time. By nightfall, another escape route was pulling away from Saigon. Around 9 p.m., Admiral Trung Tan Chong sailed the South Vietnamese naval fleet toward Vung Tau under cover of darkness. But even that South Vietnamese escape made the American one harder. Through the night, South Vietnamese helicopters, patrol craft, civilian boats, and small aircraft reached the American fleet, carrying families and refugees. Radios clogged, decks filled, aircraft had to be pushed overboard after unloading. The American evacuation force was now being swamped by South Vietnam's own desperate escape. But the hardest bottleneck was still ahead. By the early hours of April 30th, Washington and U.S. Pacific Command were now putting strict limits on the embassy evacuation. At 3:30 a.m., the order came down that from that point on, only Americans would be airlifted out, and Ambassador Martin had to leave on the first available helicopter. That made the final phase of the evacuation immediately harsher. At Tan Son Nhut, the airport evacuation was still functioning in grim, organized lifts. But at the embassy, the evacuation was being squeezed tighter by the minute. Martin reserved the roof for Americans and directed Vietnamese evacuees into the courtyard, believing larger helicopters would evacuate them from there. He sent his last message announcing the closure of the mission and the destruction of communications. But at 4:42 a.m., a CH-46 arrived with a direct presidential order. Martin had to board. Once he left, the embassy's defensive perimeter started to break down. Marines used their rifle butts to hold back desperate Vietnamese civilians who were scaling walls and forcing open gates. Requests for extra helicopters for the organized refugee groups in the courtyard were denied. By about 5:20 a.m., the last embassy officers had been lifted out. After the last helicopter lifted away, the Marines sealed doors, blocked stairwells, locked elevators, improvised rooftop barriers, and pulled back to the roof itself. At Tan Son Nhut, helicopters were still lifting people out, but at the embassy, the evacuation had been reduced to its final, desperate stage. A shrinking perimeter, a few helicopters, and the last Americans lifting away from the roof as Saigon fell below them. Even as the last helicopters were still lifting people out, North Vietnamese forces were already moving through Saigon's command centers and breaking the state apart. The General Staff Headquarters, Service Commands, the Tan Son Nhut and Camp Davis area, Ministry and Police Headquarters, Bac Dang Port, and the radio station were all seized. At the Independence Palace, President Duong Van Minh still tried to give the ending a political form. When North Vietnamese forces arrived, he said he had been waiting to transfer power, but the North Vietnamese officers facing him told him there was no power left to transfer. The war was not ending in negotiation, it was ending in unconditional surrender. By then, the retreats had failed, the exits had narrowed, and 3 presidents in 8 days had only added to the confusion. The government in Saigon no longer controlled the war or its own ending. Minh was taken to Radio Saigon, and around noon, he gave the final order. South Vietnam's government was dissolved. Its remaining forces were told to stop fighting, lay down their arms, and prepare to surrender. That was the end. Not a settlement, not a pause, not a transfer. By the time the surrender was broadcast, the state had already died. If you want more stories from history's final collapses, where power disappears faster than leaders care to admit, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.